Welcome to Hello Therapy, a podcast to help you take charge of your mental health through evidence-based psychological tips and tools straight from the therapy room so that you can live life better. I'm so stressed. Now, I'm going to take a guess that you have probably said this at least once in your life. Now, if you have a hard time managing stress or you just don't know where to start when it comes to coping with stress, then keep listening. Because in this episode, I'm going to outline a super helpful tool for managing stress called the Stress Bucket. It's completely free and I will link it in the show notes. So I'm going to take you through how to use this tool, and by the end of the episode, you'll have a better understanding of what stressors are happening in your life and to give you some ideas on more helpful ways to get your stress levels down. But before we start, just a gentle reminder that if you are enjoying this podcast, why not follow or subscribe and leave us a 5-star review with a sentence or two, particularly if you are using Apple Podcasts to listen. It takes less than 30 seconds and I can't highlight enough the difference it makes to helping other people find the podcast. So let's dive in. Stress is a common experience for most people. And when I asked how often do you feel stressed on my Instagram stories, 80% of people said most days they feel stressed. You know, we live in a fast-paced modern world. We have notifications popping up 24/7. Life is really busy and it makes sense. And the fact is that stress isn't all bad. Small amounts of stress can actually be helpful. It can help motivate and energize us to accomplish our goals. But, and it's a really big but, excessive stress over time can significantly impact our physical and mental health. Studies show that the long-term activation of the stress response system and therefore the kind of what they call the overexposure to cortisol and other stress hormones can disrupt almost all of our body's processes. And what this basically means is that it can put us at increased risk of various physical health things like high blood pressure, heart disease, strokes, problems with sleep, weight gain, lots of things. And studies also show that chronic stress can also suppress the body's immune system, making it harder to recover from certain illnesses. And of course, stress can lead into anxiety and low mood and all sorts of other mental health difficulties. So learning how to manage stress is really, really crucial. And that's what we're going to do today. So first, let's define stress. Stress is basically the body's reaction to a perceived threat or feeling of pressure. And it's generally accepted that there are two types of stress, either chronic or acute. Acute stress happens within a few minutes or a few hours of a particular event, an external event, and it typically lasts for quite a short period of time, usually less than a few weeks, but it can be very, very intense. And that sort of stress can happen after an unexpected or distressing event. Chronic stress, on the other hand, lasts for a long period of time, or it can sort of keep coming back. And you might experience this if you tend to be under lots of pressure a lot of the time. So how do we know if we're experiencing stress? Well, let's think about the physical signs and symptoms of stress first of all. It can lead to things like headaches or fatigue or low energy. You may be experiencing muscle tension or pain. You could be experiencing nausea, sleep disturbance, digestive problems such as stomach aches, diarrhea, constipation. And in terms of the more mental symptoms, you can experience things like difficulty concentrating, racing thoughts or constant worry, feeling quite overwhelmed or anxious, feeling irritable or mood swings, that's quite common. And you can also experience a loss of interest in the things that you used to enjoy doing. And of course, chronic stress particularly can lead to feeling sad or feeling depressed. And sometimes I get asked, what's the difference between stress and anxiety? And I think it's fair to say that there's a pretty fine line between anxiety symptoms and stress symptoms, and there's lots of overlap. But the current thinking is that stress tends to come from an experience of pressure. So, things like deadlines at work or someone cutting you up on the motorway. Whilst anxiety tends to relate to our feelings about a potential experience and how we're going to cope. So it's very sort of future focused. How am I going to handle this meeting that's coming up? Am I going to say something silly at this party tomorrow? Now, it's important to note that everyone experiences stress differently. So your symptoms may not be the same as someone else's. But if you are experiencing any of those symptoms that I just listed, it's a good indication that you may be under some stress and that you need to take steps to manage it. So the first step in managing stress is to work out what is it that's making me stressed. And the stress bucket model is a really useful tool for this. The stress bucket model was first talked about by Brabban and Turkington, and I want you to imagine that you have a bucket that represents your capacity to handle stress. Now, if you find it difficult to imagine things in your mind's eye, then go ahead and download my freebie. It's in the show notes. And what I've done there is I have created my own stress bucket with a worksheet so that you can jot down the things that I'm talking about, and I'll take you through that. So in my version of the stress bucket, there are raindrops falling into the bucket. So imagine that these raindrops are the various stressors that can show up in your life, and they are filling up your stress bucket. Now, the nature of these stressors is different for every person and unique to your life and your circumstances. But some everyday stressors include work or workload, exams, difficulties in relationships, money worries, things like that. Now, if these stressors exceed your capacity to cope with them, then your bucket overflows, resulting in the symptoms of stress. So if you have downloaded my tool or you've got a pen and paper to hand, just jot down some of the stressors that you are experiencing in your life. So just have a think about what those stressors are. Now, the goal of reducing stress is to keep your bucket from overflowing by emptying it on a regular basis. So I want you now to imagine that there are a couple of taps on the opposite sides of the bucket towards the bottom. Now, I know that there aren't taps on standard buckets, but just bear with me here. So one of the taps just lets the water out, and the other tap actually has a hose attached to it, and the hose goes back into the bucket. Now, that particular tap represents the unhealthy coping strategies that someone employs in order to try and manage their stress. The other tap, where it just lets the water out, represents the healthy coping strategies. Now, with unhealthy coping strategies, it is really easy to end up doing things just to cope with the stress. And perhaps in the short term, in the very short term, it kind of helps. But in the medium to long term, all it does is it creates more problems. And so the water that is being emptied from the unhealthy tap goes straight into the hose, and that water goes straight back into the bucket, and it refills the stress bucket. So some examples of unhealthy coping strategies include using alcohol or drugs to cope. So drugs and alcohol can numb emotions or can help us feel like we're escaping our problems, but this can lead to other problems like addiction and other health problems as well. Another unhealthy coping strategy can be things like excessive screen use or doom scrolling. This is a really popular avoidance tactic or another way of numbing emotions and feelings. And, you can end up doing this for hours at a time. And I think we've all done this. But if we're doing this on a regular basis to escape our stress, then we're not dealing with the stress in the best way. Another unhealthy coping strategy can be over or under eating, so turning to food for comfort or avoiding food altogether. And that can take its toll on our physical health and also can lead to body image issues. another big coping strategy that can be unhealthy and unhelpful is taking your stress out on other people. So you may snap at your partner or be more irritable with your kids or get into an argument with your friend because you feel stressed. But again, whilst in the moment, it kind of feels like a bit of a momentary release of stress and frustration, but you can end up feeling worse and guilty that you treated your loved one like that. You can spiral into a bit of a negative thinking loop around, I'm such a bad mum or I'm such a bad friend. Or it generally just causes conflict in your relationships, which creates even more stress for you. So going back to the stress bucket tool, write down all of the things that you do that give you a quick release of stress, but actually in the long run, they do not help you. What are the things that refill your stress bucket? And you may have to dig a little deep for this, because I think often we can end up doing things that we feel are helping us to cope, but it's a kind of like deep down, you kind of know that it's not really helping you. So try and be super honest with yourself. If you're using the tool that I have, you don't need to show this to anyone, it's yours, but just have a think about what those things might be. Now, the good news is that there are many, many ways to cope with stress that represent healthier coping strategies that can reduce stress and the impact that it has on your life. Now, before I take you through a few of them, again, just have a think about some of the things that either you've done in the past or that you do now that do really help you manage stress. And don't worry if you can't think of anything, because I'm going to take you through some healthy coping strategies in a moment. So here are some examples of healthy coping strategies. And number one is a classic. It's taking care of your physical health. So regular exercise is a great way to manage stress. There are lots of studies these days that show this. And I'm not talking about training for marathons. I'm talking about 10-minute walk each day if you're starting from scratch. Any kind of exercise that you like to do or that you think you might like to do, then give it a go. Number two is try and zoom out and see the bigger picture here. Often when we feel stressed, our attention tends to really narrow and we can become quite consumed by the things that are stressing us. So we can end up overthinking and we end up worrying, which further exacerbates our stress. So stepping back from our thoughts, trying to get a bit of distance from our worries, noticing and naming the thoughts and the anxious thoughts and the worries that are showing up can really help us get a bit of a different perspective. And if you're interested in doing that, then I have an episode on mastering worry, and that's episode 10. So number 3 is practicing mindfulness or mindful moments. There is lots of research that shows that mindfulness-based interventions can really reduce symptoms of stress, anxiety, and depression. So again, if you can't manage 5 or 10 minutes of mindfulness a day using an app or going on YouTube or something, then try mindful moments. And I have a blog on this that I'll link in the show notes. Number 4 is slow down. Stress tends to speed us up. We rush from one thing to the next, trying to get as many things done in the shortest time, but try and take breaks through your day, even if it's just for a few minutes or 30 seconds even, and use that time to check in with yourself. So in a compassionate tone, ask yourself, how am I feeling right now? The next one is try and practice self-soothing at times of stress or when you feel overwhelmed. Again, I've got an article on how to do this using your 5 senses. I'll link that in the show notes too. Another classic alongside exercise is get good sleep or get enough sleep. The lack of sleep can exacerbate stress levels. Research has shown this. So try and practice good sleep hygiene and aim for around 7 and 9 hours per night. So what I mean when I say good sleep hygiene, it's things like keeping your room on the cooler side in terms of temperature, trying to go to bed at a regular time each night, doing something calming or soothing at least an hour before bedtime. So another way to manage stress in a healthy way is to connect with other people. So again, studies show that good social support can really enhance resilience to stress. And also, I think linked to this is telling people that you are stressed, trying to share how you are doing, what's going on for you, what are the stresses in your life, and just getting that support from someone that isn't in your situation and has a different perspective, that can really help. And lastly, and this is a really important one, make time for doing things that you enjoy. Laughter and having fun are great stress relievers. So putting time and energy into something that you enjoy doing is essential to get a handle on stress. Now, what I would say here is that everyone is different and it can take a bit of work to figure out what are the things that help me relieve my stress so that my stress bucket is being emptied on a regular basis. So it might be a bit of trial and error to begin with. And remember, we're not aiming for a complete emptying of the bucket. I don't think that's realistic. We just don't want it overflowing so that we feel like we can't cope or we feel burnt out. And I'm actually dedicating a whole episode to burnout next week, where I'll be talking to Dr. Claire Plumley, who is a clinical psychologist and has just written a book on burnout. And she will be taking us through all things burnout and how to manage it. So that brings us to the end of this episode on stress. If you haven't already, do download that stress bucket worksheet. It is really helpful just to get you thinking about, what are the stresses in my life and what can I do to manage my stress better. Don't forget that there is always professional support available. So do reach out to a mental health professional, or you can contact us. We are Harley Clinical Psychology. So that's my associate practice, and we help people from all walks of life manage their stress. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hello Therapy. If you found it helpful, don't forget to subscribe, follow, and review. You can get more well-being and mental health tips by joining our email list and visiting the resources section of our website at harleyclinical.co.uk. The Hello Therapy podcast and the information provided by me, Dr. Liz White, is solely intended for information and educational purposes and does not constitute personalised advice. Please do reach out to your GP or a mental health professional if you need support. Until next time, take care of yourself.